Oklahoma Sooners Live comes your way each and every week. Appreciate everybody being here at the Voice of College Football on a Thursday at 3 Central, 4 Eastern. Please hit the like button, settle in, give us your comments and questions as we talk Oklahoma football with all of you, and a number of news and notes to get through. But again, we will get to your comments and questions as well. Venmo, PayPal, and Cash App if you'd like to contribute, as well as the Super Chat. And of course, guy that's made it happen now, 56 weeks. Jason Ray, last word on college football. Jason, how you doing today?
Doing wonderful, Mark. How about you, sir?
I'm good. It's about 70 degrees and sunny outside, so nice spring day. So I got out for a very brief walk before I came in, before we needed to get things cranked up. Well, the transfer portal continues to move on along for everybody. I don't think anyone's immune to the transfer portal. I've heard ridiculous numbers of players, all sorts of numbers that I can't recite right this second. So it's been massive, but the last three for Oklahoma, little impact there when we talk Noah Renz, Cody Jackson, and also I actually posted a video when the announcement came down about Rawlings Bijan. Don't believe I'm pronouncing his last name correctly. I don't have it in front of me, but three players that didn't see the field too much. Cody Jackson had like 5 catches last season.
Yeah, Mark, you're exactly right, and I think, and I'm not quite sure myself, but I think Cabange is the we can just say NKR for sure for short.
Let's do that.
But no, I think one of the things that was interesting coming into this little period between spring and the deadline to enter the transfer portal was what was Oklahoma's going to look like. Obviously, we knew Oklahoma had a bit of a max exodus between what happened with Riley and then when the spring season started. But then understanding there's a lot of kids that have really, really bought into the culture with Brent Venables and the team and the staff that's brought in. So what would that look like here? So I think it was really exciting, really refreshing to see Oklahoma, not have any you wouldn't expect, but any potential contributors. I mean, I think Cody Jackson is certainly, as you illustrated, Mark, is the one that could potentially provide a little bit of concern just from a position that Oklahoma doesn't have as much depth at, that they probably would like to have a little bit more. So, but yeah, I think it was good overall. I mean, especially specifically, to your point, when you look at everything going on across the country, and it's inevitable that I'm sure we would get into this Jordan Addison thing. At some point with the transfer portal being more, starting to become a little bit just like recruiting from a free agency perspective with NIL kind of, in the loop with all of this, but just refreshing to see Oklahoma, only having those 4. And obviously you would think that Oklahoma has some opportunity, whether it be at the probably at the quarterback position, the wide receiver position, and maybe at the rush end perspective there on the defensive side. But no, not a lot of turnover, which is good for a staff and a team that needs to have that kind of fluidity within the team.
Absolutely. If you look at the transfer portal rankings, you will see USC on top. You will see LSU there. Basically, you see a lot of teams that are in transition with first-year head coaches. And Oklahoma certainly brought in a number of key components, but in terms of losses, it's been rather minimal. Latrell McCutcheon, I saw him play in the USC spring game, and he looks to factor in pretty from a pretty integral standpoint into the USC defense this year, but they were awful on defense last year. If you look at the recruiting rankings, Cody Jackson in particular was a top 20 wide receiver coming out of high school and a top nearly 100 player. So you got to think, despite his lack of playing time and only 5 catches his first season, that he will have no issue finding a home. Very talented guy. Noah Renz, a top 24 player at his position. And yes, NRK was the 36th rated defensive lineman in the country and a top 300 player. So all of them you would think would land somewhere.
Right.
All right. Talking Oklahoma football with all of you. We will check out the live chat, bring in your comments and questions for our Sooner Talk each and every week. This is one of the big reasons why we encourage you to subscribe, hit the bell for the notifications to know when we go live, because we need to switch it up from time to time. And thanks for tracking us here on a Thursday afternoon. All right. In addition to that, you just brought to the table, Jason, before we started to record and go on live, some rumblings that Brett McMurphy's reporting concerning the Big 12. That's, of course, rather interesting. It's nothing new, nothing shocking, but finally putting some pieces in place, possibly for the 2023 season, with the expansion of the Big 12 and the three teams that have a little bit more difficulty moving on from their previous league. BYU, obviously, an independent, but with UCF, Houston, and Cincinnati, and their current contract with the American Conference, looking more so now that they'll be able to break free and join the Big 12 in 2023.
Yeah, it was really interesting, Mark. I mean, I think a lot of people thought that probably would happen at least in 2024, maybe even 25, when Oklahoma and Texas scheduled departure would happen. But yeah, given the fact that they are negotiating a settlement, according to Brett McMurphy and others, for those three, in addition to BYU, to join the conference as early as next year. It brings in an interesting conundrum for Oklahoma and Texas, right? So what does that do? Do they stay? Do they stay in the Big 12 and kind of enjoy a little bit of a different look of the Big 12 until 2025, or does that maybe force their hand a little bit? I mean, Mark, I think it's a little crazy. I seem to hear something different from both sides almost on a weekly basis, just in terms of you see some of these things, and I think initially you would think a lot of this would lean towards Oklahoma and Texas going ahead. Okay, they're going to go ahead and make this move, and don't really want a ton of a part of what this new Big 12 would look like. But at the same time, everything Oklahoma, I mean Texas especially, but Oklahoma's not particularly ready for the SEC just yet. I mean, I think they're better equipped than Texas is right now, but I think the thought process maybe as Oklahoma gets a little bit more kind of ingrained in Venables' culture, and gets a couple of years in there, and still plays around in the Big 12 with the easier path to the playoff, and then goes in 2025. So this is going to be really interesting. And so I think with this happening, Mark, it sort of starts to maybe accelerate things a little bit for Oklahoma and Texas, and maybe not necessarily that they weren't accelerated, but accelerated more publicly, right? If this comes to fruition, because I think there was some information in there that stated that settlement could be completed within the next month or two. So I mean, it almost lends you to believe if Oklahoma and Texas are going to make the move and go to actually go early to the SEC in 2023, you would think you would hear some sort of announcement in summertime, and maybe even a little bit earlier, but at least at some point this summer, whether or not that's something that that they're going to do early. So really interesting to look at some of the um, the enticing opportunities for what that schedule would look like in the Big 12 with Oklahoma and Texas, not to mention what we've talked about and what that looks like for them going to the SEC. But it'll be interesting to see how it how it unfolds. Like I said, there's weeks where I think I would say 60-70% that Oklahoma and Texas are going to go to the SEC next year. Then I hear some things where no, maybe they're not super. There's not an incredible rush to get over to the SEC immediately. So I think this brings a little bit of a fork in the road, so to speak, and it'll be interesting to see what that looks like.
I tend to like oddities in sports, whether they're statistical or otherwise. So I would love to see, and this has nothing to do with rooting for or against Oklahoma or Texas or any of the four schools entering the Big 12. It all has to do with just seeing something that we're otherwise not going to see. So if it's a clean break where Oklahoma and Texas leave the conference, go to the SEC at the same point in which the four schools join the Big 12, then we've got a new Big 12. That will be interesting, of course, for certain reasons. And of course, Texas and Oklahoma in the SEC will be interesting. But for one season, I would like to see, for at least one season, and I can't imagine it extending past that, but I would like to see all 16 teams in the Big 12. I would like to see some of the crossover matchups that we're only going to get this opportunity unless there's some out of conference scheduling that's unforeseen, that we're going to see Oklahoma and Cincinnati play, or UCF. Of course, Oklahoma has played Houston in recent years, and that's because of geography. That's been a matchup at times. But BYU, Oklahoma obviously played about 15 years ago as well. But just some matchups that we won't see going forward, because then all these schools are off to their respective conferences to stay.
Yeah, it would be very extremely intriguing. I agree with you. I'm a little I'm kind of with you, Mark. And I know a lot of people, fans and things like that, are just super excited for Oklahoma and Texas to hit the SEC, particularly Oklahoma fans. But I think that would be very intriguing, whether it's a year or even two. To your point, on seeing some of those matchups on what they look like. I think it would be interesting to see. I mean, even though OU and BYU played each other, they were I think when they played, oh yeah, that was in Dallas, so that was a neutral site game. But any kind of a home and home and things like that, if it happens for 2 years on some of those matchups, will be, would be very very interesting to see, because I think one of the things that's I think when you look at conference realignment just in general, and I know this doesn't necessarily have to do with some of these teams coming in, but we had a discussion earlier this week about some of these, with this, some of these typical non-conference, even if they're conference rivalry games that aren't going to happen, anymore, like UCF and USF, for example. Is that a game, that's going to continue to happen? Oklahoma and Oklahoma State here. I mean, I think Oklahoma's talked about how much they still want to play, and Oklahoma State's been a little bit, less committal, as far as that goes. But some of those rivalries, I know that college football has still flourished without some of those rivalries, like Oklahoma and Nebraska and Colorado and Nebraska and some others, to Texas and Texas A&M and things like that. But it'll be, I think, one of the other interesting things, just like I said, with all of the conference alignment, not specifically this, but some of those matchups, what do they look like? Do you stop seeing some of those rivalries that we've become accustomed to seeing?
Yeah, I was just surveying the various matchups. Of course, we table it from an Oklahoma standpoint, and I offered up, what we've seen in the past against BYU in particular. But a trip to Orlando to take on UCF, when most likely that's never, and when I say never, I don't mean ever, but who knows when that's going to happen. There's only so many non-conference games scheduled once Oklahoma would join the SEC. From a Texas standpoint, I find it somewhat amusing, or potentially amusing, because of Texas's shortcomings and how they continue to underachieve. It would not be the easiest thing in the world for Texas to take on a Cincinnati. Cincinnati has been a better team than Texas for the past few years, and that would just be another potential embarrassing loss. Not that it's shameful to lose to Cincinnati at this point, but Texas should not be losing to Cincinnati in the grand scheme of things. Or, again, a date against UCF would not be the easiest thing for Texas either, or BYU. Shoot, BYU and Texas played a home and home series about 7 or 8 years ago, and BYU took it to them both times.
Absolutely.
And
Yeah.
one of the games, they rang up like 500 yards rushing on Texas. And then the other matchup there potentially is, of course, Texas and Houston. And a lot of people would enjoy that because that goes back to the old Southwest Conference days when they
Mhm.
were both major players. And again, the old Southwest Conference, Houston and Texas, and renewing that rivalry briefly. So I think there's a lot of intrigue there. And again, potential for a lot of matchups that we won't otherwise see. So I would love, and then I would also like to see what the Big 12 would do about 16 teams, whether they would just, they obviously would have to veer off of their current situation of everybody playing everyone. Of course, there's just not enough games. So something would have to be set up. And regardless, the current format's not going to go on beyond that anyway, where everyone's playing everyone currently in the Big 12, even with the four coming in and the +2 net gain. No longer will the Big 12 play that format, so they're going to be making decisions concerning how they're going to proceed anyway. But with 1 or 2 years at 16 teams, whether they would decide, hey, we're gonna line them all up the way we currently do, and the top two teams in the conference are going to play in the championship game, or if they would, it would seem like kind of a counterproductive decision to make divisions that include teams that are going to leave. I don't know. That would all need to be vetted out, and it would be again intriguing to see what their decision would be.
Yeah, and I think, this conversation, Mark, specifically, that when you if you put like a truth serum in the Big 12 officials, I wonder if they would really just prefer Oklahoma and Texas to just go ahead and leave early, even though they, obviously would are going to and will, miss the what comes with Oklahoma and Texas, right? But so to your point, do you want to design a division or divisions or a pod system or whatever it looks like for a year or two and then have to totally revamp that? Because you're going to, I mean, I guess you're going to, I mean, I guess there's no rules that say Oklahoma and Texas would have to be in the same division or the same pod for a year or two. But do you put Oklahoma and Texas in two separate divisions for a year or two, and then still you still have the rest of your structure in place, or do you put Oklahoma and Texas probably not in the same division because you'd have to re completely restructure the divisions, or do you do something like a pod system? Like I mean, I haven't heard anything conclusively, but I think absolutely that's what the SEC is going to do when Oklahoma and Texas enter. So, I mean, I think those are a lot of things to think through from a scheduling perspective. So, I think, like I said, I mean, you want Texas and Oklahoma just for the eyeballs that you have on the conference with them, and just what they bring to the table from a totality perspective. But you wonder if it would be nice just to have a clean break for with everything considered.
What Robert is stating here makes sense, even though I don't like it, but it does make sense. Rumor has it that the remaining conference members are the only teams that are going to play Texas and Oklahoma, as they would want one last shot within their league. Meaning, if you're TCU and because of the entry of the other four teams, you don't play Oklahoma or Texas a final time, that doesn't seem to make sense when you've been a long-standing member, and you wouldn't play a team that's been a rival for quite some time. So I get that.
Yeah, I mean, I get that too as well. I mean, I think although it's going to be different, based on your perspective of Oklahoma and Texas. But I heard a lot of Texas people just kind of um, debating whether or not they were getting kind of the short end of the stick on game time schedules, getting the short end of the stick on, officials officiating calls because they're leaving the conference. And I think to that point, well, while that may not necessarily hold a lot of water, I think, but however, to that point, there are a lot of people that don't want to see Oklahoma and Texas succeed here in the last little bit because I think outside of Oklahoma and Texas, they're kind of seen as I think traitors within the Big 12 conference and not holding that alliance and things like that. So I think having Baylor and Oklahoma State, I think if you probably got them to tell you the truth, they were thrilled with the fact that they had those two teams in the Big 12 championship game last year, and would like nothing more for it to be similar this upcoming season.
Yeah, exactly. To your point, the Big 12 wants to make its new league look as impressive and as valuable as possible. And the worst case scenario would be that they play two more football seasons with Oklahoma and Texas, and Oklahoma and Texas play in the Big 12 championship game the next 2 years. That would be the ultimate bad look for the
Yeah.
conference to be basically saying our two best programs, even though in actuality, from a monetary or value standpoint, they are the two most important programs, and that's not going to change regardless of who wins what. But still, the look on the field to say, "Oh, our two best football teams are leaving," is not good. So that is also a good point, Jason. That's going to be um, interesting to keep an eye on that as well to see how does this break look from the standpoint of whether a strong Oklahoma and Texas are leaving the Big 12 as at the top of their game and ruling the conference versus the Big 12 getting a shot in with other teams being able to keep Oklahoma and Texas out of the Big 12 championship game and kind of say, we'll see you. And you weren't able to, win the league the last couple of years. Yeah.
Yeah, no, like I said, it's all it's all interesting, especially with Oklahoma. Kind of their streak had been broken. This past year with the consecutive Big 12 championships, and yeah, you know, the law of averages with the amount of talent that they have at Texas, at some point they're going to have a coach, they're going to get a team, they're going to have a season, or they're going to kind of figure it out, so to speak, at least figure it out enough to make a Big 12 championship run or appearance, or even a championship for that matter. So, I don't. Who knows if this year will be the year? But I mean, I don't quite think so. But anyway, I'm sure we'll get into that as the summer progresses. But no, I think it's a very interesting thing that I think, like I said, overall, I think we'll hear or we'll know something at some point, probably before the season starts. I would think. I mean, if we don't hear anything, I would think Oklahoma and Texas kind of staying pat for the next year or two.
The other determination for the Big 12 is the way the college football playoff is currently set up. It doesn't matter what you're deemed to be as a conference. Like the college football playoff committee doesn't say, well, we only select Power Five, or you have to be this as a group of five. It's just whichever four teams we determine to be the four best in the country, that's what we're selecting. But the proposals that are on the table, the ones that we've seen that have been made known to the public, and it may not turn out exactly this way, but it seems as though the model, if we get a 12-team playoff, and even if we get a 8-team playoff, is going to be that the five conference champions, major Power Five conference champions, are secure in receiving spots. Well, then there has to be a delineation made and a determination. Okay, how does the college football playoff committee view the new Big 12? Does it remain a Power Five league or not? Because it now matters. Now it's just in name. It doesn't matter in regards to a playoff spot, but it may in the future if the model that we've been served at this point comes to fruition.
You're exactly right, and I do anticipate, to your point, having some sort of automatic bid type thing for the top five, top five conference winners. What I would like to see, Mark, is not necessarily because I don't love the auto bid idea. I think what I would like to see is you get of the winner of the conference, the Pac-12, the Big 12, whoever you want to say, the winner of the conference. If you're a winner, yes, you get an automatic bid as long as you rank within the top 12 of the whether it's the college football playoff rankings or whatever that looks like. So not necessarily an automatic bid even if you win the conference, but you're a fringe top 25 team or a 15 to 25 team. So but no, I think that right now, and that's one of the things, Mark. I think that's probably a little bit of a consideration for Oklahoma and Texas in terms of how quickly they move, right? So right now, with it being four for the considerable future, at least until 2025, I think through the 2025 season into 2026, if I have that right, just in terms of when the current deal ends. So the path is a little bit cleaner right now for Oklahoma and or Texas to get to to be at that Final Four versus if you're in the SEC, your path is much more difficult to get to that Final Four spot. So I wonder how much of a consideration that will be as they look at making that decision.
Yeah. And then looking back 10 years down the line, whether Oklahoma fans and Texas fans will have considered it to be a good move. We know from a financial standpoint, there's no question that it's a good move. But the fans only care about winning games. They like to hear about the finances because there's a direct connection typically between making a lot of money and building your football program. And especially these days, there's a correlation that you can assume. But at the same time, if Oklahoma and Texas make a load more money in the next 10 years than they would have staying in the Big 12, but they ring up a bunch of 8-4 seasons, I don't think people are going to be too happy with that. It's similar to Nebraska, and I'm not predicting that. I'm just laying out a scenario because we see it with Nebraska. We do a Nebraska show here every Tuesday night, and hardly a week goes by that somebody doesn't mention in the comments that it was a mistake going to the Big Ten because Nebraska did not have a vintage final decade in the Big 12, but still they were in contention, and they came this close to winning the last two Big 12 championship games.
Right.
So they were right there. They're not coming close to doing anything in the Big 10.
Yeah, you wonder what the correlation is in relation to that. I mean, which is I mean, to your point, yes, they did. They haven't won a championship in quite some time, conference wise or other. But when you look at that the last 2 years, especially the year before, they were even closer to winning that championship with the kind of somewhat disputed out of bounds throw by McCoy there late in the game. But yeah, no, I think that's got to be part of in the back of your mind and from a consideration perspective, because I think the thought is, even if you're not competing at an extremely high level initially, you'll get the money that will allow you to kind of build up your facilities, build up your recruiting department, build up whatever you need to do in order to be successful. However, the SEC money, while it's bigger, it's obviously bigger than the Big Ten. It's not extremely bigger than the Big Ten brings in a tons of money, right? So you would think that Nebraska has that same ability, so to speak. So you kind of wonder if it's a situation where you be careful what you ask for thing. But I know that Oklahoma's all in on this from an administration level up, or administration level down, I should say. But yeah, it's kind of interesting to see, and I think part of it has to do with with who you got from a leadership perspective, whether that's the president, the AD, the head coach, all the way down. Oklahoma's been fortunate to have one of the best athletic directors in the country over the last 10 15 20 years here with Joe Castiglione. But then but in the we've beat that horse to death with a head coaching at Oklahoma, but still, I think that's part of what makes you successful is that administration, and I think there's a lot of confidence that Oklahoma has the right people in the right positions right now to kind of usher that journey into the SEC and maybe prove that it will be different than some of these other teams that have moved with Nebraska specifically, but some of these other teams that have moved over and have been not as successful. When you look at when you look at teams like Missouri and Texas A&M, that they were pretty. I know Missouri had a couple of years where they challenged for a Big 12 championship, but they were also in the SEC championship game a couple of years as well. So they've had fairly similar success moving from the Big 12 to the SEC. So I mean, I think it'll be, interesting to see how, what exactly that looks like, because I think some people, and I say people, fans will be okay, with a couple of 8, 9 win seasons, maybe even a 7 win season every once in a while if things kind of, go from an injury perspective, or whatever that might be. But you throw together too many of those consecutively, and you'll start the noise will start getting louder around the program if you're consistently throwing out those 8 and 9 win seasons.
Going to get your thoughts on this. Of course, the NFL draft was last weekend, and following the draft, I had it in my mind anyway, even before what resulted at the NFL draft, that I wanted to post a video, which I did. You can see it on the main channel, folks, where I looked at recruiting rankings for the past 5 years. And then I looked at, I'm going to look more heavily into the results on the field. So I see it as a 3-step process. You look at the recruiting rankings, which is the talent acquisition from high school football to the collegiate ranks. Then what are the results on the field? Because that's what truly matters. And then how does that talent then turn from high school player to being developed and producing results in college to the NFL draft? And it's remarkable how consistent that line is all the way through. So, as you know, for the second consecutive year, the Big 12 did not have a player drafted in the first round. And the SEC had 12, and the Big 10 had 7. And then, the other conferences fill in with 3 or 4. And I looked at the last 6 years, that's almost happens every year.
Mm-hmm.
The SEC has the most, decidedly. Then the Big 10 has the second most. And then there's a little gap again, and then everybody else just kind of fills in. But the Big 12 kind of stands out as nobody else is getting no players drafted in the first round. The Pac-12 had 4, and we know what kind of football the Pac-12's played. And I know we're dealing with small numbers. We're only talking about the top 32 players in the – but when it happens 2 years in a row, when you look over the course of 6 years, it's a pretty strong indicator.
It really is. It really is, and I think that's that's the trend, obviously, that you're seeing within the Big 12, and I think when you specifically from Oklahoma's perspective, Oklahoma's had a few in the last few years, obviously not any in the last couple, but when you think about, but it's mostly been at the quarterback position or the offensive line. Oklahoma's not really had a ton defensively, although they had quite a few defensively throughout the entirety of the draft, but certainly nothing in the first round. But Mark, to your point, I think it speaks to the decreased talent level in the Big 12. And I think there's a lot. I mean, and this kind of remains to be seen. I think when you put that specifically at the SEC level, when you put in the numbers here, are just staggering. When you look at SEC 58 versus Big 12 9, overall through that period, it's just staggering. And I think the SEC has that. They've obviously played the best football in the country, over the last however many years you want to say. And it's really not necessarily even close. The only teams that really have been able to compete, with the SEC from a playoff perspective, it has been Ohio State and Clemson, right? When you look at that, and so I think the talent gap is so wide. It's I think it's a troubling trend. I think for Big 12 and then for Oklahoma and Texas just in general. When you see that a lot of people just want to go. A lot of these kids just want to go play in the SEC. Why? Because they win national championships. They send players to the next level at a much higher rate than not only any other conference, but very specifically the Big 12. And so I don't know what to make of it between the Big 12 and the Pac 12. Obviously, I'm seeing this now that the Big 12 still kind of lags behind in overall draft picks. So it's concerning, and I think if nothing else, the fact that Oklahoma will have an SEC patch on their shoulder, I think that helps in so many different ways from a recruiting perspective. Probably most importantly, right, to get those players that you need to get them up there to the next level.
Yeah, look at what in the first, I wasn't real specific. I left out first round. So that first panel was first round selections in the last 5 drafts, with the SEC at 58 and the Big 12 with 9. And to be fair to the Big 12, there are 10 teams in the league versus 14 in the SEC. So to be fair, but it doesn't change the math too much. And then this is the last 5 drafts, overall selections 1 through 7 rounds, the SEC 310. And again, you see this consistently with every recruiting and draft metric. Then there's a drop, then there's the Big 10, and then there's a drop, and there's everybody else. And the Big 12 is usually last, and they are there at 114. Here's some other stats. Now, that's the NFL draft. Now, if you take the other end of it at the beginning of the process, from the high school recruiting standpoint, if you look at the top 50 players, Jason, in the last 5 recruiting classes, top 50 players in the country, the SEC has grabbed 117 of them, in the Big 12, 21.
Yep. It's hard to compete. I mean, we've talked about this a lot, Mark. That Oklahoma, over the last few years, Oklahoma is starting to enter themselves into some of those conversations with some of the SEC powers from a recruiting perspective. Whether it be Alabama or Georgia or Florida or Tennessee or whoever, LSU. They're part of those conversations, but they're still not winning their fair share of those battles. So I think, and that's been the concern. Whereas the talent level has, from a recruiting perspective, has gotten a lot better over the last few years. It's not really gotten to the level that it needs to be, and I think Venables understands that. I think the staff understands that. I think, bringing some of the folks that they brought in, from from an off the field perspective, Thad Turnipseed, what he's done with, with previous schools that he's been at. So I think it'll be interesting. Only time will tell. But once Oklahoma does have that SEC patch on their shoulder, does Oklahoma start winning either their fair share of the battles or even more of the battles that they would like to win that they haven't won already?
Jason, I would think if Oklahoma fans want to be encouraged, they look at Texas A&M. Texas A&M, for all their rabid fan base, which I credit their fan base, they pack out that place. They love Texas A&M football, and because of a number of situations, including Jimbo Fisher being basically having a Brinks truck backed up to his house. We look at Texas A&M, even though they haven't delivered, most people look at them now as, okay, they're kind of near the top of the list. They haven't delivered, but we look at them as this football giant. But throughout their recent history, they've stacked up a ton of 7-5, 8-4 seasons. They've never really competed for anything, despite a huge fan base, despite sitting right there in Texas and all of that. Now, here in the last 10 years, they've joined the SEC. And a lot of that has changed in regards to the caliber player they're now looking at, and even talking pre NIL, that they suddenly, as you mentioned with Oklahoma, hopefully put that SEC patch on their sleeve, and suddenly they're in the game for just about anybody they want.
Yeah, I mean, not only in the game, Mark, but they've
Yeah.
they've established the best. Well, we talked about this last year. I think Alabama had established the best recruiting class in the history of since they've been doing the rankings and the way that they have, and then Texas A&M eclipsed that this past year. So, with them, you have to think, is this going to be a continuing trend with them, or eventually the NIL dollars will not run out, but you're going to it's I kind of attribute this to a little bit of what happens at the professional side of things, like in terms of how much money are you willing to pay these players. Obviously, I know it's not the same thing, but from a just from a specifically from an NBA perspective, you'll have kind of an owner in a group that, okay, we're willing to spend a lot of money for this three because we think we've got the guys that can make a 3 or 4 year run, right? So what happens if Texas, for instance, for Texas A&M, they've got these people that are supporting the athletes from an NIL perspective and say, okay, we've got about 3 or 4 years here where we're going to willing to do everything that we can to get a national championship. And then if they don't make it, what is, if they don't win a national championship, or even they do and say, okay, we're, the funds have run out, so to speak, that we're not really willing to, to pay this anymore. So I think that's interesting when you really, Mark, when you kind of think about how NIL is going to make a big is already making a big difference, right? But it is going to continue to make a big difference in the way that some of these programs compete. I think when you have blue bloods like in Alabama, when you have blue bloods like in Oklahoma, have blue bloods like whoever you want to say, Michigan, Notre Dame, USC, whoever it is, they're going to have the ability year in and year out to be able to kind of support the athletes from a variety of different ways on whoever that NIL kind of partnership or what it looks like. So, but understanding Texas A&M has, I mean, there's a lot of money in the state of Texas, right? There's a lot of resources, but does that ever get to the point where it runs out and maybe they start putting some of that resource towards other people? So even Oklahoma this year, they recently announced um, an NIL program a couple weeks ago where they are going to every I think it's men's basketball scholarship athlete, every scholarship football player, and then I think softball player as well, at a minimum is going to get between $40,000 and $50,000 a year just for being on scholarship. They literally don't have to do anything else other than be a scholarship athlete at the University of Oklahoma for these sports. And obviously, there's going to be, there's certain within that program, there's certain um, things that you can get above and beyond that. There's some academic benefits. There's some memorabilia, jersey sale benefits that kind of come along with that as well. And then, I mean, that's one of about 5 or 6 other different programs that are being put together
Hmm.
at Oklahoma, as is going to happen across the country. So now you see this landscape in college football changing a little bit. I'm all for it. I'm all for NIL. I'm all for these players getting compensated in some sort of way. Where I struggle with, and it doesn't matter that I struggle with it, it's still going to happen. But where I struggle with it is being used as leverage for poaching players into the portal, for stealing recruits and things like that. Look at I mean, we touched about this earlier and didn't really talk much about it, but the Jordan Addison thing, he's Lincoln Riley. I mean, I know it's no surprise here, but Riley is becoming a super villain in the world of college football. Now it's becoming more outside of Oklahoma and other areas. Like, when have you um, ever seen a guy that had no intention, no change within the program, a Heisman Trophy level player like a Jordan Addison, won the Blitnikoff this last year, just jump into the portal last minute? And we all, I mean, we all know why. Whether he ends up at USC, or whether he ends up at Texas or Alabama, wherever it is, he's going where the money is, or he's going where the most money is. And yes, he's saying the right things. He's moving on to give himself the best chance uh, to succeed at the next level from that perspective. But he's going for the money. I think what I've heard is it's Pitt offered him somewhere in the neighborhood of $1 million, and I think USC has offered something in the neighborhood of $3 million. You're a kid. Where are you going to go, right? So that's the part that that's the landscape is changing as we divulge a little bit, but started with this Texas A&M thing, and that's the way it's going to be. And I think the struggle that I have, if you're not a blue blood, if you're not one of these, however you define a blue blood, or a, a regular contender, there's probably about 15 to 20 of these teams, depending on how big of a net you want to cast. But some of these other teams, they're just not going to be able to compete until there's some sort of um, guidelines or rulings or legislature in place. So, and I don't know how quickly anything like that will happen. So, yeah, I mean, these teams are gonna, and it could be somebody new every year. At Texas A&M, I would be shocked if they're not in a position to compete. Maybe they don't make it to the college football playoff, but with the talent that they have, you still got to coach them. But they'll have the talent to reach, potentially reach an SEC championship game, and potentially reach a college football playoff. They've been close, and now they've got this, additional backing. And it would be surprising for me if it's not this year, in the next couple of years, if they don't have a big move there.
Yeah, we've got a call-in show coming up tonight at 7 o'clock Eastern time. And for as much as I don't want to discuss NIL, that's what's going on right now. The Pac-12 and the SEC commissioners are in Washington, D.C. I've got a few simple suggestions. I've laid them out previously. I'm going to add a few more. One would be, again, it's almost like enforcing the speed limit. We're going to understand that the speed limit is the speed limit. And if you get caught, you get caught. But 90% of the people that speed aren't going to get caught. And I'm fine with that. But at least the guidelines, the rules are there. People know that this is what they're risking. And I would like to see the discipline to be severe. So the first one would be, I would like to see student athletes, at least theoretically, choosing their school destination based on traditional factors. Their relationship with the coaches, how good the football team is, where they want to live, how good the academic program is, all that sort of thing. And I know that I'm speaking a little innocently, but I understand what will be going on. But at least that will be stated, that there would be no contacts between NIL suitors and a student athlete until they've committed, signed, enrolled at a school, and committed for that year. That and then we know that it's still going to happen. But if and when someone gets caught, and there might be 50 schools out there that are breaking the rules, but somebody's going to get caught because they're going to tell on each other. And at some point, then you just really hammer that school. You lost 15 scholarships. You don't go to postseason play for 4 years, whatever it is. So that's number one. Number two is this tampering. And again, it's still going to go on, but at least set up the rules and say, if you're caught tampering, you lose scholarships, you lose postseason play, whatever else you want to tack onto that. You get fined a couple $1 million, and there you go. And the third aspect of that is something that you just brought up that I hadn't thought of. Well, I have, but I've always shot people down to say this is college sports and you can't set it up like a professional league, but maybe you can. And you distribute the money somewhat equally. I think there's room to do both, to say the powers that be can continue to be the superpowers and keep a large portion of the money, but there has to be some type of distribution, because the NFL, Major League Baseball, et cetera, they view themselves as a complete business. And the New York Yankees need the Kansas City Royals. So they can't just stomp on them and say, we don't care about you and we'll make $1 zillion and you can, fold in your top 40 market because you can't make as much money as it. No, they need each other. They need competition. So maybe, I don't think it's going to come from the NCAA. I would think it would need to come from the conference commissioners, that they need to get together and say, you know what, we all need each other. So we're going to set up a athletic structure. We're going to set it up to a certain extent like a pro league and say there are caps and there's revenue sharing, and we're going to set it up for the good of all. And again, not that Ohio State has to share all of its money with Northwestern, but there's some type of distribution to keep it a healthy competition.
Yeah, I mean, you're right, Mark. I think that's where we'll eventually get to. I mean, I don't know how long it'll take to get there, but I think you're absolutely right, and I feel strongly that the NCAA probably won't be part of that. And I think a lot of these schools are just going to do, eventually going to go off and do their own thing. You've heard rumors about, breaking off from the NCAA and kind of having their own government body, so to speak, governing body, so to speak. And but it'll happen because it's. I mean, I don't know that I would quite say it's completely out of control right now, but it's heading in that direction. The tampering stuff is probably the part that is most bothersome to me. But there's so many ways around it. It's going to be, unless, to your point, unless you
Yeah.
just quite frankly are just stupid enough to get caught. There's a lot of different ways around it that you're not going to get caught, and so whether it's ex players or whether it's whoever that's kind of reaching out to some of these guys, or whatever it might look like, then um, but yeah, it's I think it's going to be something that I know you hate talking about it. I don't love talking about it either, but it's something that's
Yeah.
certainly more and more prevalent in the game.
And you're right, Dave. NIL are laws, they're state laws, but I'm talking about building a structure that would be rules.
Yeah.
We want to honor Jess here. Jesse, thank you so much for the super chat. Jess had asked about whether we had talked about Emory Jones, which we spent a lot of time on Emory Jones last week and dissected his game quite a bit. Um, is there anything else out there? Of course, the deadline was May 1st to enter the transfer portal, but
Well, it's kind of funny that you say this. This actually happened as we were on the air, but he has committed to Arizona State.
okay.
So Pete Thamel had just tweeted that out about, I don't know, 30, 40 minutes ago. So yeah, I mean, I think that's and then Jerry Bohannon is in the transfer portal as well. Most recently from Baylor. Which I know we talk about from an NIL perspective, we're talking about some of the sneaky stuff, but I mean, you got to give tons of credit to Dave Aranda with that. He could have milked the ability to have Jerry Bohannon, but he did the kid a solid, named the starting quarterback in spring, gave him an opportunity to go somewhere. But I think from Oklahoma's perspective, we talked about this as well, that it's going to be difficult for Oklahoma to find a guy that has experience and is willing to come in knowing that they're going to be a backup. So, I mean, I think there was a couple of questions around here. Is Oklahoma still going after? I absolutely think they are, but being able to find that guy that's willing to do that, um, it's going to be sort of kind of a Where's Waldo type of situation. So, I mean, I think there's probably at some point as the kind of the situation goes on and time goes on, maybe guys aren't if there's a guy here or there that meets what Oklahoma wants from a character perspective, and then also is willing to come in and learn and potentially be a backup, they'll get there. But if not, then they'll have to roll with what they have. But I do think that Oklahoma's going to continue to be diligent in that. And I think the quarterback and the wide receiver positions offensively, and like as I said, the rush. And Oklahoma actually has a visitor from Arizona State, wide receiver that's in the portal. LV Bunkley Shelton, I believe, is his name, from Arizona State. I think 33 catches for 400 and something yards last year, a couple of touchdowns. So he's actually visiting Oklahoma this weekend. So I think that's a guy that would be, that would be potentially a guy that Oklahoma would take. I mean, if it's interesting enough where they'll, bring them in for a visit, I think they like that. So Oklahoma, I think they'll be, whether it's just one guy or maybe a couple of guys at the wide receiver position, they'll continue to be active there.
Yeah, and if everyone is aware of the Arizona State situation, that's where I pegged Emory Jones to go. It's just wide open there. They lost Jaden Daniels. They have the NCAA hanging over their heads, so they've not been able to attract until now an experienced quarterback, and they had a quarterback battle going on between two quarterbacks who had thrown about 20 passes between both of them, so they are able to acquire somebody. And again, Emory Jones makes the obvious move to go to a Power 5 program, probably the only one left that has a clear path to the starting job.
Yep.
All right. Anything else we need to hit on the Oklahoma front?
No, I mean, I think the only thing that we didn't talk a ton about is the announcement with Oklahoma's partnership with ESPN Plus that happened today. It was a little bit rumored yesterday. I heard, got a little bit of whiff of that, but I think it kind of became reality today. And I think most people locally understand, with Oklahoma, typically what's called their Sooner Vision broadcast, and a lot of their what they call a tier three, not tier three sport, but a tier three um, partnership from a TV perspective. They've had a partnership previously. It was with Fox Sports, and now it's with Bally Sports, which is it's one of those things where it's not super widely available, specifically with customers that are not cable subscribers. If you're streaming or anything like that, it's not available. So just the demand that Oklahoma has, Oklahoma has had this deal with them with Fox for quite a while, and part of that deal is where they're forced to broadcast one Oklahoma football game on pay-per-view each year, which is just, I mean, it's just asinine. Just thinking of it nowadays, there's literally no teams specifically at a level that Oklahoma that has to um, broadcast broadcast their games via pay-per-view, whether it just be one or however many. But and I think it's the first partnership, I think, of its kind, where Oklahoma has specifically with a streaming service. So Oklahoma will have their one pay-per-view game per year go to ESPN Plus, as opposed to being a pay-per-view situation. I think they had somewhere in the neighborhood of 25 men's basketball games that will be broadcast through ESPN Plus, Olympic type sports. So like softball, you would think wrestling, gymnastics, things like that. That will be part of that, and then specific programming, coaches shows, and things like that. So really, I think it's a win-win. Obviously for Oklahoma, it gets them closer to. I mean, I think this probably morphs into SEC Network or SEC Network alternate at some point. In the future, once Oklahoma makes the move to the SEC. But I think beneficial for for Oklahoma. I think it's a better deal money wise, certainly, and I think a better deal for fans. I think it's right now ESPN Plus is like $6.99 a month. And if you have like a Hulu subscription or whatever, I think it's even included in that from a streaming perspective for free. So I think value add for Oklahoma. And I think the thing that took this over the top is Bally Sports is no longer going to be something that's wide. Even though it's not really widely available right now, it's going to be even worse because they are turning it into a streaming only situation for like $19.95 per month. So I think just the value that Oklahoma fans will get with having not only football but other sports available on ESPN Plus is going to be great.
All right, everyone, we appreciate you being here for Oklahoma Sooners Live and for being flexible to join us on a different day at a different time, Thursday this week. Keep those notifications coming to know when we go live. We typically hit the mark on Wednesday at 11:30 a.m. Central Time. So, but we need to be flexible. So we appreciate you guys doing that as well. And we will all get together next week. Bring some other college football fans with you. Of course, Oklahoma fans first and foremost with you next week as we bring you another edition. Jason, we appreciate it. Is there anything going on at Last Word on College Football we need to know about?
No, it's kind of in the area of, post spring, early fall camp. So, a lot of, we've got a lot of wrap up stuff from spring season and a lot of, looking forward to the fall. We've got a lot of good series specifically coming out right now with the Big 12, looking at the top, the top five at each position that we're doing, along with the total staff is doing that right now. So good time to jump over there specifically for Big 12 people that enjoy reading that content.
All right, folks, appreciate you being here. We'll catch everybody next week right here on Oklahoma Sooners Live.